Well, thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be back here. I come to this place every now and then. My presentation is inspired by NATO's first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, who stated that the goal of the alliance was to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. I would like to present an alternative scenario to stimulate the debate. And I raise the question based on, my starting point is the Americans out, as was mentioned, the Germans up and the Russians in. And based on that, I raise the question, what would be the consequences of such a scenario for NATO? Now, let me start with Russia. It has been mentioned by many of you already, but let me sum it up sort of as part of this broad framework. It has, as you know, become increasingly anti-liberal and anti-Western. It returns to history, sort of, to its traditional view on the world outside, characterized by ideological distance and strategic conflict of interest. And as you know, Putin is about to carry out a rather massive defense reform, nourished by, on the one hand, a fear of encirclement, and on the other hand, guided by a compelling ambition of reversing the retreats of the 90s. The armed forces are transformed into stronger, leaner, and more mobile organization. He has developed a range of instruments of state power on a scale and to a degree of coordination hardly seen before, I would say, notably the combination of traditional military power, unconventional and civilian means. And he has, as we know, demonstrated that he is ready to use military force and all these instruments by way of direct operations, pressure, and intimidation. In the north, this kind of return to history is reflected, first of all, in Russia's reactivation of the Bastion concept. As you know, the strategic value of the north is primarily rooted in Russia's strategic nuclear submarines in the Bastion eras and the need to protect them against hostile forces. So in a conflict as we read it, Russia will seek to establish control in its immediate vicinity and to deny enemy forces access further to the west and south. Down to the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap, as Heather touched upon, and in fact even further. And Russia's ability to harm capital ships and harass the transatlantic sea lanes has raised a rather acute need for reintroducing hardcore security into the maritime strategy of the alliance, as the defense minister mentioned yesterday. In any case, the result of this military modernization is that Russia is increasingly able to create positions of local military advantage in its immediate vicinity, which means that Russia is in. At the same time, and I would like to emphasize this point, stronger than both Heather and Ivor, Russia is weak and vulnerable. Its GNP is, after all, no larger than Italy's. Its energy-dependent economy is unreformed and uncompetitive, and the lack of structural reform helps preserve unbelievable corruption, kleptomania, and nepotism. Crimea and the Donbass are huge drains on Russian resources. Furthermore, Russia can be forced to spend a lot of resources, also militarily, in the south. It's a soft underbelly to manage volatile regimes and extreme Islamism. And let us also add that Russia is on the defensive to a growing China in the Far East, which, despite the closer bilateral cooperation, is viewed with some trepidation by the Kremlin. So, if you sum all these, sum up all this, it's rather overwhelming, I would say, the challenges that are facing Russia. And I would say it's not obvious that Russia in the long run will remain a major great power and exert a significant influence in Europe. That is, from my perspective, an important part of the long-term reading of the challenges in and around Europe. At the same time, one should have in mind that nations in decline can be very unpredictable and very unpleasant to deal with. That's an important part of the picture as well. Well, the Americans out. My second question. Let me start with the key premises, that there is no NATO without the United States. The US guarantee and forced contributions makes a huge difference. It makes the difference. When we need a strong US leadership to maintain cohesion and direction in the alliance. So keeping the Americans in is a prerequisite for NATO to survive. So the question is Washington ready to stand by its commitment? Well, we cannot be too sure about that, according to a number of commentators. At least three external factors, in addition to the domestic situation, and as you touched upon, should be mentioned that might undermine US military support and guarantee to Europe. And you know those factors. The first, of course, is the deep and complex problems in the greater Middle East, which require much US attention and resources, possibly even far more in the future. Next come, of course, the rebalancing towards the Asia-Pacific, which would most likely require far stronger US involvement than today to support partners and to challenge China's A2AD. And third comes the American expectation that Europe should contribute far more to the common cause. My simple answer to that is that it will not happen. Ever since 1953, when Secretary Dulles threatened to undertake an antagonizing reappraisal of US commitment to European security, Washington has every now and then proclaimed that a new burden sharing is a precondition for future US engagement. But with very few exceptions, the Europeans have never taken that warning very seriously. And the simple reason for that is that disengagement on the part of the Americans would harm US interests in the most serious way. That is the European reading. Let me simply mention 5 factors behind such a reading. And the first one is that Europe is America's best friend. And NATO is, compared to any other cooperation, let me emphasize that, NATO is exceptional both politically, as a political community, based on common values, as a platform for shared interests. NATO is also, secondly, despite its many faults, and they are numerous, of course, it is a unique arena for building competence and interoperability, the gold standard for members and partners. It is also unique because of its integrated defense set up in peacetime, the package of contingency plans, designated forces, and joint headquarters. Most of that has become rather rusty, and it needs to be reinvigorated, but that will happen in due course. The couple is talking to each other. They are talking about a common future. I won't argue that this is a happy marriage, but I'm quite convinced that both of them, all of them, realize that any alternative is far more depressive. NATO the third factor, is also the key arena for the US to sustain its influence in Europe and help to keep Europe stable, whole, and free. Fourth, without NATO, the Americans cannot expect much European support to military campaigns in other parts of the world. For many countries, if not for all, the main reason for such participation is to keep the Americans in and to uphold Article 5. Last but not least, should serious doubts be raised about the US guarantee to Norway, to Lithuania, Russia would be given a golden opportunity to achieve its vision of creating a major sphere of influence. And I would also indicate that Taiwan would feel compelled to readjust the fundamentals of its policy, which means that the role of the US as the major global power could be torn to pieces. So that's what we basically are talking about. That's also the reason why most Europeans stay calm every time America's defense minister or the ambassador to NATO threaten to reformulate US policy. What about Germany, my third question? Can it make a difference? Even in the security realm, I sense that most Americans would tend to say no, whereas many Europeans, in fact most Europeans, are inclined to say yes. That's a part of the picture, the different interpretation of the role of Germany across the Atlantic. I won't go into that here today, but that's an important part of the picture. Germany is an indispensable nation in Europe as the economic powerhouse, as the most important security provider, if we talk about security in the broadest sense. Germany is a powerful defender of multilateral solutions, which of course is an important part of modern German mentality shaped by the lessons of history. The euro would have collapsed had it not been for German leadership and discipline. And such a collapse could have severely weakened the economic and political framework of Europe. The crisis is not in any sense solved, but it's no longer an imminent crisis in Europe, and that's a good thing in itself. Now, many will argue that Germany is too soft on Russia and hesitant when it comes to the use of military force. Again, as you know, one should remember that this reflects the burden of history and that the victors actually taught them after the war to be and act in such a way. We all contributed to shaping that German mentality. So it will take a long time until Germany becomes a normal great power. If we take the narrow perspective and the Warsaw Summit in July, the Germans will underscore the importance of dialogue. Indeed, they will not be the spearhead in enhancing NATO's defense and deterrence, but they will, after all, join the impatient majority who are eager to add new measures to the joint defense efforts. Germany is about to become the geopolitical center of Europe. It will remain a different great power in the foreseeable future. It will be ready to use force, but only as a last resort. So that's my starting point. So based on this, after having outlined the most likely policies and positions of Russia, the US, and Germany, my last question would then be, what would be the consequences for NATO? Well, the alliance is in a dual position. There are challenges, yes, of course, but there are also opportunities. On the one hand, Russia's military buildup has made it increasingly capable of overrunning territory in its near abroad. On the other hand, the West is far superior to Russia if all its economic and military resources are mustered in a unified way. So that's, so to see, my starting point when I look at the potential for NATO in the future. It leads us to the question how to manage Russia. And I shall limit myself today to the military means, not the broader security policy or security perspective, the dual track and things like that. But if we stick to the military dimension, there are at least two possible approaches to this problem. The first one, and I find that very well established in the military community, is to build a strong, symmetric, direct defense that would take away Russia's ability to create positions of local advantage and thereby also shift the onus of escalation back on Moscow. And NATO is at least moving in that direction. Many countries are increasing their defense spending. We see a positive trend after years of neglect. It's not an impressive trend, of course, but there is a certain change. Britain, the US, and France now form, that's my reading of the situation, they form a kind of troika and play a key role in shaping the future of the alliance. And Britain is back after Prime Minister Cameron won the election last year. The Strategic Defence and Security Review from November gives a clear direction. It's underscored by an increase in defence spending and in the reintroduction of key capabilities as the carrier strike groups, the maritime patrol aircraft, and so on and so forth. That's not unimportant. I would also add that France has become a forceful actor both in combating terrorism and in containing Russia. And all these, this is also part of the picture, they show a great interest in improving the joint defense in the north. But that's not my topic today. In addition to that, we have the NATO Readiness Action Plan, we have the US European Reassurance Initiative. They make a difference, and these efforts will be expanded in the time to come, as was mentioned earlier today. Let us also add that the, in fact, most promising tendency is the establishment of clusters, bilaterally between small groups of nations within the framework of NATO's collective organization. There are a number of them: the German Framework Nations Cooperation Concept, the British Joint Expeditionary Force, +++. These are extremely important seen from my perspective. And when we, so to say, look at the totality of the efforts, one should pay particular attention to these efforts. In the long run, as Heather touched upon, there is a potential for a far deeper Northern European cooperation. I would say also in the defense realm, especially so if two of the countries in the region, Sweden and Finland, should join NATO. That opens up for quite a strong potential for expanding the cooperation in Northern Europe. So there's a movement here, which is promising after all. But having said all this, defense spending in Europe will not increase significantly, partly because other challenges and priorities are seen as far more important, including the economic and migration crisis. And sadly enough, the nations will not undertake any major restructuring of their military organizations in order to get more bang for the bucks. In short, NATO will not build a credible direct defense. What might be the alternative? I indicated there are alternatives to the direct defense approach. Well, that is to rely on the Kremlin's fear of NATO escalation, that we mobilize the West's economic and military potential and respond and escalate immediately using all available means, including horizontal escalation. And that is, in fact, NATO's implicit strategy today. It's a more risky strategy than the symmetric one, but that's what we have at this stage. So that's what we have to base our planning on. But in the longer-term perspective, if you take into consideration that Germany is on the rise and I'm very unsure about the future of Russia, this balance might be changed. Well, my reading of the situation might be wrong. You know, the flapping of a butterfly's wing might change the course of history. We might have a new president in Washington who decides to carpet bomb in the Middle East, setting the region on fire and tie down huge military forces from the United States. Or perhaps we should listen to neither to Lord Ismay nor to me, but to Professor Andrew Bacevich, who once wrote, "Thanks to NATO, the Americans pretend to have allies, Europe pretends to contribute to global security, and the Russians pretend to have an external enemy." Thank you for your attention.
Må vi vente litt, ja.